Hello, my name is Paul Taillon. This is a part of the Strategic Thinker series of the Policy Insights Forum. Today I am delighted to have Stephen Poloz, the author of The Next Age of Uncertainty. Stephen served as the 9th Governor of the Bank of Canada from June 3, 2013 to June 2, 2020. As Governor, he was also Chairman of the Board of Directors of the bank. He has recently been awarded the North Star Award for 2025. On that note, I'd like to welcome Steve. Thank you, Steve, for coming in today.
Delighted.
I'd like to start off with a question. In your book, The Next Age of Uncertainty, you note that COVID-19 was a test of resilience. Were Canada's governmental institutions and initiatives to address COVID-19 successful?
Well, it's a good place to start. It's true. I remember just before COVID-19, Canada was sitting there with inflation 2%, exactly on target, and unemployment was at a 40-year low.
Oh, wow.
So a very resilient position from that macro standpoint. If you're going to get a cold, you want to be healthy to start with, right? And this is a good place to be. And throughout, I thought we would be reasonably resilient. And at the time, of course, we had no idea how it would turn out. At the time, we spun out a best case scenario and a worst case scenario because I didn't want to put out a new forecast in that environment. And 3 years later, the bank issued a little report through a speech to basically show we took the best case scenario.
Yeah.
And so that's quite a victory of sorts. And what was underneath that? I think it was basically very prompt actions. We didn't have the sorts of delays that other countries had. It was a very immediate, both monetary and especially fiscal response. You could argue about the formats. It could have been perhaps simpler. It could have been different in many ways, but it worked. And basically, the economy collapsed by about 20% that summer, spring and summer. But before Christmas, we were back to 98%, and that was a very quick recovery. And after that, the economy was growing in the 98%.
Right.
And still locked out in the 2%. Those were the resorts, the hotels, restaurants. So that sector suffered the most through this. They wouldn't say it was very resilient, but as a macro statement, we did a good job with that. And of course, there's side effects, as you know. At the time, I said, the firefighter never gets criticized for using too much water. But then he's supposed to come back and clean it up the next morning.
Right. Well, what do you consider are the key economic and political challenges facing Canada today?
Oh, I think we get a nice laundry list there, Paul, but I think fundamentally we're not very competitive in the global marketplace. And I mean competitive, of course we have attractive resources and we have attractive goods, especially attractive services for sale to the world. And we do this quite well, but we are very unattractive as a place to invest. And not just for external investors, foreign investors, but for our own companies who have lagged investment for the last almost 10 years. There's uncertainties everywhere. The biggest uncertainty they faced is the future of NAFTA, starting with candidate Trump,
Right.
And then becoming President Trump. And even though it was renegotiated, threatened to rip it up again almost immediately. And not much change under Biden, really, in the sense of that. And so one of the consequences of that is and of course, there's lots of other things in Canada that we are proud of. We're proud of our environmental impact assessment processes. They're best in class. And we're really proud of our Indigenous reconciliation path and the need to consult. We're proud of those things. And yet we did not develop strong processes to go with them. They're great concepts, but we've made things very, very slow. And sometimes things just can't happen at all. And I think we're going to need to address that as we go forward. There's a lot more things you could talk about, like tax rates and so on, which also deter investment. But first things first, the processes need to be sharpened.
There's been much discussion as to our national debt, and this has been dramatically increasing, particularly under the Liberal government. How can we address this economic challenge now and into the future?
We were in a pretty good debt situation federally prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, everybody used fiscal tools to cushion the blow from COVID. And so as a consequence, we have a big explosion of debt. And remember, I mentioned the best case versus worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario, we had figured out, would take our debt ratio to about 60% of Canada's GDP.
Oh.
And so as it turned out, came up short of 50.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in the high 40s.
Right.
And that ratio has been gently working its way down as the economy has outperformed everybody's expectations in the post-COVID period. And made the fiscal situation more sound. We can't forget the provincial debt, right? Which is means more than doubling that number. So you are up in a much higher ratio. But if you compare that to the United States, well over 100% of GDP and rising rapidly still, despite the fact that COVID is long behind us. And so, is it? So you ask, what do we do about that? I still think we should do something about it. I'm not saying it's okay to be like this. We probably should be more aggressive in getting it back down to where we were, which was below 30% of GDP. And as you can see, that position allowed us to do gargantuan things to meet the challenge of COVID fiscally. And now what we should be doing is putting us back on track to be back there. So that we're prepared for another big thing that may come along, whatever it may be. And we've been, I think, a little too gradual with that process. And arguably very little progress. When we get the numbers, the latest numbers, we'll probably find we've actually backtracked because the economy is pretty weak right now. So all to say, I think what we should be doing is fiscally preparing more. And that's not to say that where we are is particularly dangerous in the global context. Not so bad. At the time, the worst case scenario, around 60% of GDP. We were worried about that kind of number because that's where we were back in 93, 94. And you'll remember that. And so the big difference is interest rates were far higher back then. And the debt load was very, very straining for the government and for the economy. We're nowhere near that kind of thing. But we're still not prepared for the next big thing. Right.
The COVID experience clearly demonstrated the problems of globalization and the problems relating to the global supply chain. How do we address these sort of challenges?
Yeah, I think probably we, as in a policy sense, we may not really need to do anything except to make sure that our free trade agreements and by the way, the also with the free trade agreement is usually an investment component, which sets up the rules. If you make an investment in another country, you're recognized as if you're local.
Right.
Those kinds of rules. Let's make sure those things are ironclad and robust, and that if there's an opportunity to even improve them, let's go ahead and negotiate those things. Because under those umbrellas, companies are actively de-risking their supply chains. So people put a simple spin on this: globalization's over. Well, no, I don't think so. Globalization is far too life improving for us to turn our back on it, somehow be self-sufficient. I mean, I'm going to guess you don't do your own dry cleaning, you don't grow your own vegetables. That's trade. Well, trade with the world is the way we've established this kind of situation where we want to maintain or improve it even more. So the way to do that is to de-risk the supply chains, and companies are actively doing this by saying, well, I've got a mandate for this component coming from China, and that kind of got disrupted during COVID. It could get disrupted by trade policies in future. So why don't I split that mandate in half and have the other half in, I don't know, Philippines, Malaysia, and there are a lot of places actually. And as it turns out, these places are, let's say, more like-minded, similarly reliable, and actually these days have even lower costs from a supply chain point of view than China, because China has evolved a lot over the last 20 years. All to say that you know, I feel like today, as we're living with supply chains that were designed by the CFO before. And now what we're doing is we're developing a supply chain designed by the chief risk officer.
Right.
And they're different.
Yeah.
And they might actually, in the end, cost a bit more because you're sourcing from more places. But that's just a form of insurance.
Right.
People will gladly pay for insurance. That's a way to pay for insurance. And so I think that's where we're headed. And we just have to make sure we don't have to put up any barriers to this. We want to make sure that it can work and let companies figure out what is best for their business. What's best for their business is almost inevitably best for Canada.
Yeah.
We don't need to mastermind it or manipulate it or encourage it or force it. We don't have to do those things, in my view.
Right. In a growing geopolitical threat situation, how can Canada address the costs relating to our defense and security requirements, which have been ignored for the last decade? What are your views?
Yes. Touchy subject, right? But I think just my casual interactions with Canadians suggest there's a lot of sympathy with that
Right.
out there. I haven't seen a poll that actually addresses it, but I'll tell you an idea that I would like to push forward, and that is that if we want to spend 2%, let's say 2% of our GDP, which people now think of as kind of a floor as opposed to an aspiration.
Right.
The quickest way to do this would be to add a 3% special GST to every transaction in
Right.
Canada. And if it was labeled as, you know, our special military tax, and people had assurance that that's exactly where that money was going, and that they would get value for money,
Right.
I think people would be very supportive of that. That would have a lot of implications. That would, of course, be roughly 2% of GDP,
Right.
3% of consumption spending. And then, of course, we would still have a GST rebate for those for whom that's causing harm to their purchasing power. But the vast majority of the GST is paid for by people who can afford it.
Right.
And so suppose we did that. Then you could go into the federal budget. You could say, well, we no longer need a defense line in the budget. We do need a defense plan for what we're going to do
Right.
with the money that's coming from that special GST. But you would have savings from the current budget in order to, you know, manipulate that. And secondly, to go with that, I would also say, wouldn't we be better off if we collaborated more fully, maybe even fully, with our partners in the United States? And that partnering would take the form like, why would we study for 6 months or a year which guns to buy, or you know, why would we study for 20 years which aircraft to buy? Why wouldn't we just say, you know, we're as part of that team, we're in defense together.
Right.
Tell us what's our best contribution. If it's defending the North, let's invest heavily in this. If it's submarines to patrol the North, let's invest heavily in this. And everything else that we need to procure, just tell us what we should procure. And then I think you would save a great deal of time and effort, and of course, a big slice of that sort of the slow public service part,
Right.
the procurement part, which I think you could just say, well, we don't need that capability or not nearly as much of it. And I think so that's a package that I'm proposing to you, right? Several things to change at the same time. But I think it would give us a lot of marks, the Americans. We would say we'd have guarantees in that we would have a certain number of personnel in Canadian uniforms in each of the services.
Right.
So we would negotiate that. But everything that we bought for them would be exactly the same material that they use south of the border. There'd be bigger inventories. There'd be no studying them. I've heard that it can take us maybe 3 years to replenish the shelves after we gave a lot of material to the Ukrainians. How can that be?
Exactly.
Well, there's a process. There's RFPs. There's I call them Boy Scout processes. Right? Whereas we could just say, let's skip the Boy Scouts and let's just get our stuff through the same channels as the United States, so that we're a full partner. And I'll leave it at that.
Oh, interesting. What initiatives and or policies would you offer an incoming government to best address our expansive economic problems and increasing national debt situation?
Well, that's a tall order.
It is.
And so I think mainly what we want to do is make sure the economy can grow on its own.
Right.
And I think we've thrown up, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, a few barriers that kind of either stop or at least slow down. So in an economy where it can take us almost 12 years to build a Trans Mountain pipeline, in that same 12 years, the Americans built thousands of miles of pipelines to run their system. You know, I'm hearing that if we wanted to build a data center, because we think AI is, so in Canada's got cooler air, so it's a good place to have a data center. It's less costly. We have green energy to fuel it, and we can develop more green energy to fuel it. Well, people think that it might take 2 to 3 years to get the permits for this. If an investor is looking to invest in a data center, they could go to a haven for data center, AI, intelligence, and all the IP that goes with it, Texas, and they can have a permit in about 7 days.
Oh, dramatic.
So I'm not saying that we can suddenly turn ourselves into 7-day permitting places. We've got multiple layers of government. That, you know, a data center might involve a municipality, it may involve a province, it may involve obviously the feds, and it's going to have environmental issues, and it may be near indigenous lands, or, you know, there's lots of issues. I get all that. But couldn't we turn that into an objective of, let's say, a ceiling of, say, 6 months? It's sort of horizon over which investments actually get thought about and made. And, you know, why couldn't we have that as a challenge and make ourselves good like that? I think we would make our whole economy a much riper place for new companies and developments. And I'm not just leaning on resources because of the examples that I'm giving, but, you know, any kind of infrastructure decision, which is crucial to growing a business, takes us forever. So I think the biggest thing I would say to an incoming government is, if you can fix this, and that could mean a better collaborative model with the provinces and municipalities, a can-do kind of. I don't mean can-do as a reactor, but can-do kind of attitude around it. Like, this is a national priority. Let's all get behind it. Let's never mind the politics. It's about business.
Yes.
Right. And you know, if there are certain things that governments need to overcome, certain barriers, then they should go ahead and do them. And they can do them in a fiscally neutral way, but so it doesn't affect their book, but they're taking a risk off the table, let's say. And so if it's construction risk, okay, well, let's go ahead and take that risk off the table. And if it takes an extra 6 months to build something because of whatever, okay, that's the government's risk. That's okay. But then the other counterparties who are in that project aren't hurt by that. And then it's all pure economics for them. And, you know, doing those kinds of things aren't subsidizing things. They're just making sure that you've paved the way. And then once things do get moving, then, of course, every bit of economic growth gets taxed in the usual manner.
Yes.
So the taxpayer can't lose from this. But we always fuss over whether it costs the government some money or some risk up front to overcome some kind of a hurdle. And we know those exist. And that goes in the budget, and oh my gosh, that's adding to the deficit. No, it isn't. It'll be fiscally neutral by the time. It's an investment. And it'll go away in due course, and then you've got nothing but the returns from the investment, which is more jobs. Those jobs all pay taxes to a government.
Exactly.
And so on. And so I think we kind of think of things kind of in an odd way sometimes. And so if you had if I was advising a new government or a new form of the current government, this is what I would say. Let's get our act together on those two fronts. And the defense thing, well, that's a good idea too. So let's keep that on the list.
I like that idea.
All right.
Now that we are in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, what economic and political lessons have we learned, and how can we best prepare for possible future similar threats and mitigate its impact upon Canada's economy?
Yeah, so some of the tools that were developed on the fly during the pandemic are tools worth having at the ready or even having as part of our baseline.
Right.
So think of like the most visible tool that was deployed for people was the CERB.
Mm-hmm.
They all sound like radio stations, CERB. And so that was the $500 per week for people who'd lost their job. And administered through CRA, which was a very fast method to do.
Right.
And so that really worked really well. It had some arbitrary elements, and of course it was open. It was done quickly, and it was enabling.
Right.
And so it also enabled a few bad actors,
Mm-hmm.
So that was inevitable in a way, but as a macroeconomist, my priority was, let's make sure the money gets out there. We can't argue about this for 3 months or that while people are completely without incomes. We're trying to stop the clock in the economy. Well, so in the end, it performed really well if we can tighten up some of the loose things, which is great. And I would favor having it there all the time. Economists call this many things, but the most common term is a universal basic income.
Right.
Which is available to everybody who doesn't have a job. And the immediate reaction to, pure thinkers would be, well, that's just encouraging people to be lazy.
Right.
But it really is a minimum income, and you're entitled to it. And if you do get a job, you get to keep it. It doesn't just immediately fall away like many of our programs. And so you would be surprised just how inexpensive that would be and how much security would be conveyed to fragile people, households, by that. And you'd also probably be surprised by how much money you could save as a government by all the other things that you do
Right.
for people that are designed in one way or another to relieve stress. Imagine how many programs could simply evaporate and be replaced by that one thing. And then with that, it's kind of, I call it infrastructure, risk mitigating infrastructure. Then what you'd find is a disaster comes along, it turns on automatically. It's an automatic stabilizer. And by the way, when you get your job back, it turns off automatically, right? Because it's an automatic stabilizer.
Right.
And so I think having that already built, agreed upon, and ready to go, and actually running, because for a small layer of society, it's like kind of a replacement for a lot of things. I think that would be put me in a lot stronger or more comfortable position. And the other place where I would do something is at the other end of the spectrum, which is pensions. So the Canada Pension Plan is, one of the best things we've got, and I've got its sister or cousin over at the in Quebec. Those things for those individuals, of course, everybody qualifies for that some way, but they aren't enough to kind of remove your longevity insecurity. So people who have an actual pension plan from their employer have this sense of comfort throughout their lives. And, well, I may not save much money. My kids got to go to college. Okay. Oh, the furnace is broken. You're not saving much money. You get through. But you know that if you retire, even if you're forced to retire for some reason, technology or whatever, the pension's going to kick in.
Yeah.
And so, and you also have your Canada Pension Plan too. So you're like, oh, I'm okay. I'll be okay.
Right.
And that allows you to spend your life spending more or less freely. Now, people who don't have that security, what do? Well, they have to save on their own. When we say, oh, look at the arithmetic. This is what you need to do. Okay, but that means, though, the entire risk of how long they live is borne by them. How much do I need? Well, Uncle Bob, he lived till he was, 96. And well, look at Aunt Mary. She's still here. She's over 100. I better prepare for a long time.
Right.
Well, that means you underspend your entire life. And maybe you don't because you end up living to 100 and you needed all that money. But if you pool everybody with the same problem, next thing you know is they don't have to worry about how long they live. They live to 80, they live to 100. It's all the same. The thing carries on because there's always going to be somebody who dies at 80 and somebody else lives to 100. It may not be you, right? But you've taken that risk and pooled it. Well, if you do this, then all the regular folks that don't have those fancy pension plans can live their lives in a much more secure way and spend freely, and the economy will have a higher consumption path, higher investment track, more economic growth because of that extra security, taking a risk off the table.
Yeah, interesting.
It's not that hard to do.
Yeah. I'm interested in your book, The Next Age of Uncertainty. Why did you write it?
I didn't intentionally write a book. It was a bit accidental.
Right.
So when I retired, I had lovely offers to be on a couple of boards. And I actually wondered what would I bring to the table in that setting. I mean, I've headed up organizations and so on, but what would I bring? And so I thought, well, as an economist, what I could do is try to help companies think about longer term issues. And what should they be prepared for? Not this year.
Right.
Over a 5-year horizon, that sort of thing. And so I could bring something there. So I began developing some ideas around those things and writing little vignettes that I could use if someone asked me to give a speech. Oh, the economy is going to go up or down or sideways. And oh, by the way, did you know the demographic thing? You know, that next thing you know, you're talking about, you know, the aging baby boomers. People, oh, I didn't know that. There. So there's your speech, right? And so I had that as my idea. And once I collected enough of this material and researched it and developed it, I realized, you know, these things kind of connect together.
Right.
And that gave me that thought about the arc. And then I developed my own personal story to try to connect people personally to the economic issues that I was trying to address, because I didn't want it to feel like an economics textbook.
Yes.
So in the end, it became a book kind of all in a flurry in the winter of 21, COVID time, when you couldn't travel and we had very little else to do. And I didn't even tell my wife I was writing a book.
Oh, really?
No. Once I had around 90,000 words, then I talked to a friend, Amanda Lang, who read it overnight and told me it was terrific. And then she introduced me to all the right people. Next thing you know, it is a book.
Wonderful.
So that's so why did I write it? There's why. And once it became the idea or a germ of a book, then I thought what I wanted to do was to help the corporate boardroom prepare for that future, and also to make sure it was not just a corporate board table conversation, but a kitchen table conversation.
Right.
So when the family's there, and I remember my dad and my mom talking about inflation. I remember them talking about that. And would wages keep up? Stuff like this. And so those kinds of things do get to the kitchen table. And so I think that making it accessible should help that conversation. And, for sure, it seems to be doing something at the corporate board table. So that's how it ended up.
All right, interesting.
Yeah.
My last question was, where do you see Canada going in the future?
Well, look, sure, Canada is still, I mean, it's it's the best place to be. Right. Right. We talk about our problems all the time, and I feel almost discouraged to talk about those problems when I know, like, I wouldn't choose to be anywhere else.
Right.
And so we've got the ingredients to be better. We'll manage if we don't get better. Right, but we could truly make this a launch pad for higher prosperity. We've been falling behind in the flock of Canada geese. The world is a flock of Canada geese, and of course the lead Canada goose is an American. It's kind of an odd metaphor, I guess. But the point is, we're in the slipstream, so we have advantages, and we have a lot of advantages. Back when they negotiated the first free trade agreement, the key subject on the table was energy. Energy security. Right. Well, energy security still matters quite a lot, right? But I think we've kind of achieved that in North America. And in the next era of energy, we know we have all the ingredients to achieve that too, and be self-contained in green energy. So good for us. We have the material and the resources to do this. But I think the next big thing will be critical minerals, the most strategic thing. And who's got a lot of that? Well, Canada does, and it's very, very underdeveloped. So it faces all the problems we talked about. Well, let's get our act together. So we've got that important thing to have on the table when we're negotiating with the United States or others. And by the way, the whole world sits on a three-legged stool. Okay, so it's food, water, energy. And who's got more of those three things than we have?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we need to be strategic about those things. You know, we can't have, you know, growing our agricultural sector and finding it impossible to get it out by train to ship it out to other countries.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot fall behind on those basic infrastructure elements that limit our ability to grow on those three legs of the stool. And one of the ones that no one's mentioning really is water.
Yes.
And, you know, we waste an awful lot of water. It just flows out into the ocean, gets salty, and after that it's very expensive to get it back.
Yep.
So there are things we could do to harness that resource, not just for electricity, but the resource itself, just before wasting.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I think we have an exciting future, and it'll all be enabled by this new fourth industrial revolution, which is digitalizing everything and supported by AI, connecting all our dots.
Right.
We can't be the last to embrace all that. If we are, that's our own fault. But I'm confident that we'll have a major leap in our standard of living over the next 10 to 20 years. And if nothing else, even if we just stay a bit behind the Americans,
Right.
that'll still be a good place to be.
Absolutely right. Well, Stephen, thank you very much. On behalf of Policy Insights Forum, we really appreciate your time and your enlightening comments. Particularly, I did enjoy your book. And I thought, and I'm not an economist, so it was written in terms that even I, as a sociologist and a historian, would greatly appreciate. And thank you for showing up. Thank you, sir.